Hello and thanks for watching my weekly video. This week we're going to do things a little bit different. Instead of my updates on what's going on in the county, I have a special guest joining us today for a discussion. Today it's my pleasure to talk to my predecessor, former county executive Ike Leggett. And I asked him to join me today in honor of Black History Month. Ike was county executive from 2006 to 2018. He was the first black county executive, also first black county council member. And so you've had long years of service in Montgomery County. And I thought it would be good to talk to you about how you view your election from an historical perspective and, and things related to that. So I'm going to turn to you, and it's always good to see you and good to talk to you. And thanks so much for coming on today. I'm really glad that you're here, and I look forward to this discussion. So let's get to it. So my first question was, now that you're not county executive anymore, what are you doing?
Well, first of all, thank you for having me. And I look back at the job today and I say to myself, when you look at the challenges you guys had to deal with COVID, plus all the other difficult issues that you have to deal with, that was a difficult time period, and did a wonderful job in getting those things through. So it's a little bit different than the time that I served, but the COVID was a game changer, I think, for virtually everybody in elective office. Well, today, I'm involved in a large number of things that really go to my passion. I never looked at the county executive job as a job per se. I looked at it probably more closely to community service. But my real passion has always been education. And so I'm doing an awful lot of things in the educational field. I serve on the board of Regents, for example, the University of Maryland System. I've been recently named to the BSO board in Baltimore. I serve as a member of the Board of Advisors of the University of Shady Grove. But more importantly, the board that I'm spending a great deal of time at, I've served as the chair of the implementation board for the Blueprint for Maryland, which is a real change in educational policy and operation throughout the state. So a number of boards and a few others around the county that I serve on. So it's been a lot of board work, but primarily around the areas of education.
Well, that was always your passion. You were a good supporter of education when you were a council member and as executive, so it's not surprising that you're doing that now. And you've helped on a number of projects we're interested in with the University of Maryland. Our interest is getting the university to more and more think of itself as an economic development tool.
Oh, yes,
in the county. And that was not historically. It was very much it's an ivory tower. We think, we learn, but getting them into the things we do have value, and we bring value to people who may want to come here. And that's kind of where we're trying to move things to here.
Well, there's a close nexus between education, especially higher education, research, development. And I chair the committee for the Board of Regents on economic development, which I think is dear to you in Montgomery County in terms of some of the things that you're trying to do here. So there's a nexus that I think people need to be aware of, to the ability that we are able to basically educate people, more importantly, to tie that to the economic growth of the county and the state as a whole.
So that you helped on the Institute for Health Computing, and that's the first graduate program from the university in Montgomery County.
Yes.
And they already opened up on Executive Boulevard. We're looking forward to the thing going public. But that was one of those things that is key to the life sciences industry. It's going to advance life sciences. And the university recognizing the economic potential for the state was really helpful in getting this done. I thank you for your part in helping move that thing along.
Thank you.
It will be a big deal.
You're welcome.
So you were born in Texas and grew up in Alexandria, Louisiana.
Yes.
So can you talk a little bit about your early life growing up in the South and what ultimately brought you to Washington, D.C.?
Well, I actually was born in Texas, but it's sort of a thing just across the state. But I never lived, per se, in Texas. We lived in Louisiana. And I grew up with one of 13 kids in what I call abject poverty. Lived in a 3-room house, no indoor plumbing, no lighting, none of the niceties that you see today. It was a difficult childhood. I always had as a passion, and the people that I saw that really stood out as recalled in the community were people, African Americans, who were part of the military. people whom everybody looked to in terms of the community as a whole. And so my early life passion had been, well, I want to be a military person. I liked the uniforms that they wear and so forth. And I liked how all the people relate to the military people. But growing up, one of 13 kids was very, very difficult in the height of Jim Crow segregation. By the time I finished high school, I was an athlete. I played quarterback football, but I'd broken my leg. I didn't have an opportunity to get scholarships to go to school. And my objective at that time was to simply join the military, first place to get out. But my parents, my mother especially, my high school football coach, urged me to try to go to college. I had no money, no scholarships, no ability to do so. But there was a work-study program at Southern University, which was about 100 miles or so from where I lived, whereby you could participate during the summer months between high school and college, earn at least some money toward college, live on the dormitories on the campus, and hopefully get a chance to get in. Well, I got on a bus and I traveled for the longest distance I'd ever traveled in my life, which is about 100 miles. Walked up to the business office and asked them to allow me to participate in the program. And they asked me for my letters of recommendations and all the things that had been certified to allow me to participate. I didn't have anything, and they told me no. Well, to make a long story short, they told me no 4 times that day, that I could not participate in the program. But eventually, at the end of the day, they decided to give me an opportunity to participate in something similar to the program. I could live in the dormitory, but the only job that I could get would be working with the outside maintenance crew, which meant picking up trash and mowing the lawns around the university campus. That's what I did. Mowing the lawn, picking up trash around the university campus. And somehow, working in that sun and looking at all the other kids in the dormitories and looking at those in the libraries, working in the offices, I said, I don't want to do this anymore. And so I made a commitment to really pursue education in a way that I found myself being remarkably successful at, because I had been simply an average student throughout most of the high school years. But I actually learned much more than I realized. I just simply had not applied myself. And so with that application and motivation, I really turned into a very, very strong, outstanding student academically. So by the time I left the school, I had been president of all of my classes. I was president of the student body, got involved in the civil rights struggle, met people like Dr. King, Stokely Carmichael, H. Rap Bell, John Lewis. I was part of all of those things, a very radicalized student on one hand, but I was also still interested in the military. And I pursued ROTC, and I pursued it with such a passion that by the time I finished school at the end of the college, I was a distinguished military graduate, and I became a graduate. And so if you look at it, most ROTC students are reserve officers. I excelled so well that I became a regular distinguished military officer as though I graduated from West Point. And so as a result of that, I actually went into the military. But before that, Mark, I had this unusual set of circumstances and conditions. Imagine this. I'm in military uniform on campus, leading marches across the campus as it relates to the military forms, preparing to go to Vietnam. I'm also the student government president, and I'm demonstrating against the war in Vietnam. So I had 2 distinct roles at one point, playing a military officer and student government president. And I did both of them simultaneously. But I was so committed to the military, so committed to what I had my passion to, that I went to Vietnam and became an Army captain in Vietnam. And so all of the other things that followed from that. In Vietnam, I decided to get out of the military, decided I wanted to go to law school. And I excelled at law school beyond my wildest imagination. And all the other things that you've seen about my life sort of unfolded from that point on. Became actively engaged in the county in many commissions and boards. Was a White House fellow. I was an officer in a number of agencies around in the federal government. I served as a legislative aide. I was assistant dean, associate dean of Howard University Law School and professor there. So But it was the military, it was my involvement in civil rights, and my strong passion for public and community service. But it was a difficult, challenging struggle coming from Louisiana, abject poverty, to ultimately being the county executive and engaged in a number of things around the county. Now I want you to imagine this transition. A person who barely did get out of high school, who fought and struggled in the height of Jim Crow. I'm now over an agency in the state government that is looking at the transformation of all public education throughout the state of Maryland. In many ways, I say to people, this kind of a story can only happen in America. It can only happen in a place like this. And we look at Black history as we're doing today, it is a reflection of that history and the commitment of so many people that preceded me that have given me the inspiration, the motivation, and the opportunity to be in the position that I'm in today.
I share with you the protests over the war during Vietnam.
Yeah.
So coming here, what did you find different? I mean, viscerally, in the climate in Montgomery County at that time, which I guess is the mid '60s, versus Louisiana. I can guess, but you can probably say it better than I can guess it.
There are differences. The people are much more open. There's an openness and welcome to what you have here, but let's not make it a mistake. There are differences and challenges even in areas that are outside of the South. You have a greater opportunity, I think, in other parts of the United States. But those opportunities still come with some strings, some challenges and difficulties. And I've had to suffer through all of those in my role in public service, in my role in some of the elective offices that I've had, just in everyday life. Even in the Northeast, in the in western parts of the country that I've traveled in, I've always found some level of difficulties. So we make the mistake to assume that because of the challenges of a greater magnitude in the South, that other places are as open and acceptable as you would want them to be. There are challenges and difficulties throughout the entire country. But I found exceptionally here in Montgomery County was an openness and a welcome spirit which people really gave me an opportunity, and I was able to allow my abilities to move forward in a way that people welcomed. And I think that was a big difference. It was a welcoming attitude and gave me far more opportunities than I would have had other places.
So who are the early leaders of the Black community who may have mentored you or helped you along the way as you started getting involved in community and thinking about politics?
The one that comes to mind, first of all, is Roscoe Nix.
Yeah.
Roscoe Nix was an outstanding community leader. He paved the way for an awful lot of people to excel. And he was fearless in his attitude about change. I learned an awful lot from him. I would not be in the position that I'm in today without people like Roscoe Nix, Hanley Norman, Ruby Rubin, Odessa Shannon, Gladys Young, and so many others who paved the way for me to achieve the level that I've achieved in Montgomery County. But the one that I think I place at the top of all that would be Roscoe Nix.
Yeah, I loved Roscoe. He was not an incrementalist.
Yeah.
He didn't want to hear that things take time, and I've always agreed with that because like take time. I mean, the Civil War was like we were 150 years past the Civil War. How much time does it take to accept people basically is the same as you are,
Yeah.
with the same rights you have? And I tell the story of there was an interview I saw in the movie I'm Not Your Negro about James Baldwin.
Right.
And he's in the halls of Congress, and some reporter pushes a mic in his face and say, "People here say you're going too fast. What do you say to that?" And he says, "They want us to wait another 40 years." And I was in the movie theater and I thought, 40 years, let's see, 65 plus 40, 2005. Actually, no. And that, to me, is one of the most distressing things, is the pervasiveness of racism and the damage it continues to do, and the inability of this country to come to terms with it, to have any kind of reconciliation commission. It's like some people still think they lost the war and it was a terrible thing.
Yeah. Well, you were talking to Roscoe Nix. Roscoe Nix is really the person who urged me to run for public office. I was very reluctant to do so. I had formed an organization called SURGE, which was designed to elicit people in the community to sort of break the color barrier, because by the time I decided ultimately to run, not only we had not elected an African American, a black person to the county council, we had not elected any person of color to any county political position, Asian, African American, Latino, any, the legislative body to any of the elective offices. After forming the organization, I was trying to recruit other people to run. And everyone looked at the numbers, because African Americans, for example, made up about 6 or 7% of the county, Asians about 2%, Latinos about maybe 3 or 4%, and those numbers were intimidating. I couldn't get anyone to run for that office. And Roscoe finally looked at me and said, well, you should do it. And I said, no, I don't want to do it. He said, no, you should do this. He said, you've gone out here, you've talked the talk, you need to walk the walk. How can you look at yourself in the mirror tomorrow and say that you're not going to do this when you're making all of these statements all over the county about the need for doing this? You're not the person that you ought to be unless you step forth yourself and run. And given Roscoe's admonition, ultimately I decided to run. But I had no intent to do so when I first started the process.
So housing was a big issue back then, and access to housing. Can you recall any of the struggles to actually open up access to neighborhoods in Montgomery County? What it was like back then to have that debate?
Well, we had some strong advocates who were trying to make changes in housing, but it was difficult because the challenge that we had, and large numbers of African Americans who lived on the sort of the outskirts of the main portion of the county. There were always challenges of water and sewer connections, that you just could not get perkable land. That was one. Then the cost was pretty extensive because you didn't have connection to transportation or recreation. You were far away from schools. And so there would always be challenges about even the people who wanted to do it. The costs and the challenges associated with that were just simply too burdensome. But we had some very strong people, and you look at communities like Scotland, look at Sand Spring and some of the others, where people got out and fought, but it was a collective effort, not just of African Americans, but a broader community effort. Joyce and Alan Siegel, for example, worked with the people in Scotland, did a tremendous job in bringing a broader coalition together throughout Montgomery County to make it happen. But if you look at the county, though, most of the success has been not just historically among African Americans, but a broader community coalition of people who've come together to make these positive changes. And housing is a good example of that.
I thought Montgomery County, because I grew up, I moved here at 60 from DC. I was 10 years old when I moved here. I felt that the county handled integration, even if it wasn't perfect, better than a lot of other jurisdictions. So whereas across the border with Prince George's County, it was a much more of a fight, particularly in the schools. And while there were people here who weren't comfortable with integration, they didn't rise to the level of becoming an impediment. And you didn't wind up with school boards who did everything they could do to make it impossible. So,
well, you're here when the big fights over in Silver Spring and Rosemary Hills.
Oh yeah. I mean, Rosemary was, well, I think it was built around the year I was born, but that was like the first housing development that didn't have covenants sitting on top of it. And I moved into a neighborhood off of Forest Glen Road, newly built in 1960, that also didn't have covenants. And as the covenants vanished and eventually were made illegal, the population was able to spread to other parts of the county. But I know people were very anxious to get into some of the neighborhoods they got into when the barriers finally went down. That was an important thing. You ran for county executive the first time, and I remember you, not the executive county council. I remember you describing your initial ads in that campaign, and I think it's germane to kind of Black History Month and how you felt you had to be presented in order to have a chance to be heard.
Well, it's sort of unusual. I had a really strong background resume, but the question we had in the back of our mind was whether or not people would give us an opportunity. And we wanted people to look at it, to read it, to understand it. But they had to read it. And so for 6 months or so, there was no photograph of me on any campaign literature. It was basically Ike Leggett, and you had to read through it, and if you read through it long enough, you would figure that I was an African American. But we've achieved the purpose if you've gone through it and read through it, because you've seen, oh, this guy's this, he's that, he's wonderful on these issues. So we did that. And we went through that for a long period of time, and essentially we ended up winning. Now, we may have been a little bit overly sensitive to that, but I remember something that happened between the primary and the general election. After we won the primary, my photograph is now on the literature. We're at Weston Avenue at the metro station. I'm passing out literature. I'm feeling very good the fact that we won the primary. And there was a gentleman that walked out of one of the high-rise buildings in Friendship Heights. He's coming toward me, and I'm standing there at the metro station at Weston Avenue. I give him the piece of paper, literature with my photograph on it. He looks at it, looks at me again, looks at it. He said, "Oh, young man, I'm sorry, I don't vote in the District of Columbia." The assumption was that I was on the wrong side of Weston Avenue, that I was confused, that I should have been on the other side. I didn't say anything. I think I had a sort of strange look at my face. And the guy left, and I said, boy, that was pretty weird. 2 weeks later, the gentleman who I saw at the Metro called me. He said, "I want to apologize." He said, "I don't know why I said that. That was inappropriate. I just made an assumption, and I'm stereotyping you as a member of the District of Columbia, not in Montgomery County." He said, "I looked at your background, I read an awful lot about you. I want to help you." He ended up, Mark, working in my campaign all the way through for every office that I ran, up to the last one that he died right before that. It touches me every time I think about that, because it was an encounter that confronted all of the stereotypes, the racism that you would see occasionally. But in that instant, he changed, and I had a better reflection of the people that I ultimately would represent. That was a heartbreaking moment for me. But it turned out to be good.
I think one of the most groundbreaking things you did, today we've implemented racial equity lens, and we look at where we make our investments. But I remember when you came in as county executive, and I think it was your first budget, and you were doing rec centers. And you piled money into the rec centers in the black community that been allowed to sit there and rot while the county was building beautiful new rec centers in the rest of the county. And it was probably the most graphic evidence of how racial biases, without saying a word, find a way into government policy. So nobody said we're not going to fix a center in the black community, but they never rose to the importance or the value of, in some people's minds, of building the rec centers in the white communities. And when you did that, there was like a pause, and you could feel, people take a breath, because there was a new direction and a new way of thinking about things. And I really think it kind of paved the way for the racial equity work that we're doing now, was being conscious about where you make investments. And I've always thanked you for that, because that was one of the most important things that you did. And how did you see it when you were going about doing it? Did you realize that it was not just an investment, but it was making a statement?
I think you hit it right. It was to make a statement without making a statement. I didn't say this is the purpose for which I'm doing that, but it was a good example, as you've just described, because the rec centers are what? They are visible. They're a place which the community comes together, and you can see it. There are things that you can do that will demonstrate change, but you really can't see them until much, much later. But building the center and having people come there together and do the many things that they would do in the center is a visible display of that. And so you do it without saying that you are doing it, but the evidence is reflected, the fact that you have the center, And it provides you with a platform, it provides people with an understanding that there's a new change or direction in Montgomery County, that we'll continue to do all the things we've traditionally done, but there are some people who have not been able to really advance in this county, and we're going to make sure that the entire ship rises to take everybody into consideration, that we're going to build this larger table.
Yes.
Yeah.
So I think we're continuing to try to build a larger
Yeah,
table.
yeah.
I mean, we need to make room
Yeah.
for everybody, and I feel like we've probably got the most diverse council
Mhm.
we ever had. We've
Yeah.
made a lot of progress there, and I really do. You were a trailblazer, and you opened things up. And do you feel the burden of it? Did you feel the burden of knowing how you would be looked at and how you might be evaluated as you govern the county?
Only in the sense that when you sit down and talk to your grandkids, and you talk about the things that we discussed earlier about your life, much earlier, they don't see quite those kinds of things because they grew up in a time where they saw an African-American president, an African-American astronaut. They see all of these other things, and the assumption is that things have always been that way.
Yeah.
And so it is important to go back and remind people the progress that we've made, the struggle that's still ahead, but we have made progress. And I am only happy to say in many ways that I've been a part of that, but we still have an awful lot left to go. But it's not something that you talk as much about, but you demonstrate it by actually doing the work and making the accomplishments possible.
I think that's something that's lost on a younger generation of people. I don't just mean little kids, I mean teenagers and very young adults. There's a sense of American history and a sense of change.
Of any history.
Yes, any history. But like thinking that things are always this way. I mean, I taught 4th and 5th grade, and it was incomprehensible to kids that there was something different. This was just the way the world was, not knowing the struggles and the efforts that had to be made to bring it even to where it was now is not part of their understanding, which also, I think, unfortunately, makes them more passive about accepting things as opposed to realizing that every generation fights to improve and move things forward. If you think things always were this way, then you don't get an appreciation for the struggle that people like you had to make to get things to where they are now.
Well, it is important for us to remind people, because I look back at the time that I was going through school and thinking about African American history at the time of Black history. It was very limited in terms of what you actually were exposed to, for the most part. You remember Booker T. Washington, George Washington Carver,
Oh yeah.
a Ralph Bunche, and 2 or 3 others, but you don't get that entire exposure of history. History is being made all around you by a variety of people who agree with or disagree with it. We have an opportunity to create and to engage in history making in a way that I think many people don't automatically see. I never thought of myself as, even in a very limited way, as a historical person in the county. It was only through kids who talked to me about, the first this, the first that. But if you recall, for the most part, throughout most of, if not all of my political life, you never heard me say that I was the first of anything. Others said it. I never said that. I never campaigned on that, because I thought that people would recognize that simply by my presence and the work that I would do. But others talked about Ike Leggett was the first this, he's the first that, but you never heard me actually say that. It was others who said that, but
Yeah.
My view was that if I do the work and I make the accomplishments that I think that I can make, the entire community will be a beneficiary of that. Black history is not successful if it's only celebrated within the Black community. That's a limited view of history. It is history for everyone. The maturity of our country would be, at some point, we don't have to talk about Black history as an exception or an attachment to history. That would be so interwoven into all of history that we simply take it for granted, and it becomes evolved in our educational process, and it becomes an everyday affair. Hopefully we'll get there someday, but unfortunately today is not that day.
I taught school, and I've always felt that reserving the teaching of this to months kind of took away from the normalcy of it.
Yeah.
And that you could interweave history into all the stuff you're doing so that the kids get to see the multiple ways in which this has played itself out. I'd say the same thing about labor. People don't realize, the role that labor unions played. All these things we have today came from labor unions. Nobody gave them to us. They were things that workers struggle for, the rights that the black community have. Nobody just woke up one day and said, we were terribly wrong here, and we think we're going to fix it. I think of the struggles. I think of the Watts, and the emotional trauma that created in some people. But it was also a realization, this can go really bad.
Yeah. Well, you remember years ago when there was an exception we talk about in sports? Oh, there's a black quarterback in the NFL.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. Remember, and we would turn the TV on and say, oh, there's a black quarterback playing on a game. But what's going on? You look at that now, it's just accepted. You don't talk as much about it. We still have progress to make because we're now saying there are not enough black coaches.
Yep.
My belief is that someday that will simply become an acceptable norm in our everyday life. And that multiplies across a number of things. I see that in the military. When I was in the military, very few African Americans are black generals. Now you see that we now have an African American who's not just a general, who's been a general, but head of the Defense Department. That's the kind of change that you see, and hopefully as history evolves, all of these things will become part of that mosaic, and it simply become an everyday acceptance. That's the history that I want to see.
I don't know if you remember early sports television, but in the early days of baseball and football, D.C. was the southernmost city. I think in St. Louis there were no southern teams, and the Senators and the Redskins had a hold on the market in the South, the Southeast, down from Maryland down to Florida over the Mississippi River, because they were the last segregated teams. And they wanted to stay segregated because it pleased their audience. And probably didn't please all their audience, but it was certainly something that was concerning. Young adults today, kids growing up, what would you advise them? And what do you think is maybe the biggest factors in the kind of disconnection we're seeing? I saw it when I was teaching kids who don't think they have a future and articulate. Where does it come from, and how do we deal with it more effectively than we're doing right now? Because we are not terribly successful.
You need to be engaged. You need to be involved, because it allows you to better understand, to participate, to make change, and to offer voice. One of the things that I'm concerned about is our young people are not as much engaged. We're isolated in terms of how we educate kids, how they interact with each other. It's a social media society that does not allow for great deals of participation and engagement. So the biggest challenge that I see is the engagement part. In time past, people are actually engaged, working together, involved in the community. I see less of that today. My mother taught me something that I didn't realize at the time in terms of success, that it went in one ear and out the other at the time. But ultimately, she taught me three things. She taught me the power of education, knowledge, and learning. And that's one thing I think young people need to be able to do, to get as much knowledge and learn as much as possible. Secondly, we need to work hard and engage ourselves in all forms of facets of our community. Hard work, engagement, involvement is another thing that is success. And then thirdly, we need to have the moral and ethical attitudes about how we treat people, how we work together, the values that we have, and how we treat people that are different than we are. So the three things that I think are important would be, A, learn as much as you can, educate yourself, and never ever stop learning. Secondly, work hard, engage yourself in all forms of facets of your community and all types of people. And thirdly, having that moral and ethical black foundation that allow you to make the right decisions about your community and about yourself.
And where does all that come from? Where do we, what are the levers that we need to move in order to impart that? Because
well, it's a
schools
combination.
are a
I don't
place.
think there's any one single one, but one that I think it comes from, first of all, is from your family environment, whatever that may be. That needs to be a part of that, because if you're not teaching it in school, you make sure you got it at family and your social networks and so forth. And people need to have an engagement with that, and that's why I think you have to get engaged and involved and so forth. The second would be by leadership. I believe that leadership sets an example. What you say as county executive, whether or not you want to admit it or not at times, and whether or not we think we're being or not being that role model, we are role models in many ways. And kids look to us in terms of how we conduct us, of how we treat other people. What are your values as you relate to how you set a budget? That means something. That's a statement about your values that is ultimately passed on to other people. It's a wonderful statement. And I've always amazed of how people pick things up. And here's a lesson that I learned one time, which was a negative lesson to me in terms of leadership. We had an opportunity over a number of years to build a center for addiction in Montgomery County. And it was basically the state had the responsibility to build it. And we were going to provide the development money, the programming and so forth, and help get them moving in that direction. It took a long time for us to do that. The state was always behind in providing the addiction center. We had another opportunity within that same period of time because monies were available and we had the land, the opportunity to do so, and the way the budget cycle developed, to build a new animal center. And we were able to move ahead, and we got that done. State money on one hand, lacking was a state facility. County money and land available allowed us to go ahead with the animal facility, and we built it. Beautiful one. We have it in the county. I was at a town hall meeting, giving the usual budget presentation. The lady stands up and says to me, "Mr. Leggett, how is it that you can build this outstanding, beautiful animal center and you don't think as much about the welfare of these people who are suffering from addiction?" Mark, that hit me in my face like a ton of bricks. There was a logical financial answer for that because of the state and the county and the disposition of the resources. I could have given an answer that said, well, no, we're trading different monies. You don't understand why this happened.
Nobody wants to hear that.
I looked at her and said to her, almost with tears in my eyes, "You're right. We're going to build it. We're going to build it. If we have to build it ourselves, we're going to build it. We're going to get it done." That hit me like a ton of bricks. And it said something to me in terms of my values, that I had allowed myself to walk through this financial budgetary maze and didn't recognize what the ultimate outcome would be until the lady stood before me and expressed those words. Now, people on my staff and others said, well, why didn't you just explain to her what those differences were, because you had a logical explanation for that? I said, she never would have accepted that, nor would the public have accepted that, even though that may have been technically, financially, budgetarily correct. It would not have been morally correct. It would not have demonstrated leadership and responsibility.
I remember those discussions, and I've always felt like we can spend an amazing amount of money in the shelter. We struggle to house people in the homeless centers, and we still don't have, we have the Avery Road, but we don't have the capacity. We were actually talking with the state about the old noise facility, and they're not using it. And we said, can we use it for treatment facility? We're thinking about it. We're thinking about what else. It's like, you got a crisis today, you got a problem today, you got a county that's willing to step up and provide a facility, which is the hardest thing to do. You could probably find money for the staff, but it's finding the place and the money afford to buy a facility. And here we've got one the state already owns and it's empty.
Yeah.
So I know that feeling of like, this ought to be a priority, and it's an easy win, and there are people who don't want to take it.
Yeah.
And I've kind of learned, you know, you did a lot of things that I think involved, you know, looking at the morality of a budget. That people think too much that if you're spending money and it's an expense, they don't think of it as an investment. And people who usually do better than you look at how to spend money as an investment that's going to make things better, not bemoan the fact that they're spending money. And it's struggle sometimes.
Mm-hmm.
To, you know, but I think you set the right tone and the kind of leadership that made a difference here. I just wanted to let you know I really appreciate it, and thank you for coming on today.
Well, thank you for inviting me, and thank you for serving this very challenging job in Montgomery County. I know the challenges that you face, and you've done a wonderful job in leading our great county.
Thank you.
Okay.